All right. So would transactions that require just a single digital signature, basically meaning private key, be optimal for a potential US CBDC system, right? And so basically where we're going with this is only you, the payer, who's initiating the transaction or sending funds, only the person sending funds has to use a private key in order for the transaction to go through, right? Instead of having like both parties do it, where you and the person you're sending money to, or business or whatever, or maybe an intermediary, or however you want to complicate this stuff up with private keys in general. But basically, would that be the optimal form for a US based CBDC, right? And kind of thinking about the pros and cons of that, and also keeping in mind that this could be used for like access tiering, right? To where maybe below a certain threshold you don't have any signatures at all. Within then above it maybe you have one, or if there's another tier you have multiple, or however you want to structure it. Or I guess not you specifically, but like, however it happens to be structured. What would this kind of be the optimal way for most transactions, right? And so looking at some of the pros is it would be more secure than having no digital signatures, right? Because there's no without the digital signature, it seems like there's no kind of proof of ownership in a way. Yeah, there's kind of the wallet address, but there's no like private key associated with that transaction specifically, or whatever it happens to be for that, right? Also, it may help decrease unauthorized or accidental transactions. And basically where you're kind of going with this is the whole kind of phishing and that kind of cyber kind of scam stuff that you deal with all the time, like emails and that sort of thing, where like fake emails or phone numbers or social media accounts, whatever it happens to be, right? So keeping that in mind. And I talked a little bit about that more in the video with no digital signatures, right? That being said, another one would be it would be more functional and possibly even more efficient, right? Especially from the ease of use perspective than say having multiple digital signatures. Because if you're the only one who has to do it, if you want to learn how to, if you don't already know how to use the private keys and that stuff with kind of crypto related things, we'll say to kind of keep it flowing and I don't know, without muddying it up and trying to explain too much, I guess. But basically, it might make it easier to use, right? Also, this is also kind of the default for retail commerce, right? It seems. So like credit card transactions and that sort of thing, as well as like many other private sector administered digital assets, right? And kind of where I'm getting these from is from a paper published by the Office of Science and Technology on kind of a technical evaluation on a potential US CBDC, right? And looking at different design choices for such a CBDC, right? So with that being said, a link to that paper in PDF form will be in the description, so you guys can read it yourself. I always like to put sources in there because I don't know, I like when people talk or use papers and stuff, I prefer to read it as well, just because there's that interpretation aspect of it. But regardless, to continue on, to go on kind of the negative consequences of this, of only having single signature CBDC transactions, would probably be less secure than the multi-signature ones, because there's kind of less verification involved or proof of ownership. So maybe instead of you just being like, when you use your private key, it's like, yes, I have these funds, and then you can send them. Then maybe on the other hand, having a multi-signature transaction, maybe also the person you're sending money to has to use one of their private keys, or a private key or whatever, to basically verify that they received them in the correct amount for the correct thing, or whatever happens to be, right? What other kind of transaction data is necessary, at least on that kind of, we'll say, party to party part of the transaction, kind of excluding intermediaries for now, at least to kind of think through, right? So another one would be with only one digital signature, there's just a single point of failure. So like if you forget your private key or something like that, or you mess it up, or whatever it happens to be, if it gets stolen or whatever, there's only one, right? So there's one point of failure for you to use that, right? Whereas maybe you could have if you forget your private key or lose it or whatever the case, it gets stolen, whatever the case may be, right? Maybe there could be another private key associated with your, we'll say, public key, so like your wallet address, that's held by an intermediary that you can go to basically, generate a new one, or you can do that yourself, or clear it, or whatever the case may be on how you want to structure the system, right? So yeah, the next point I've already kind of done with, but basically, again, to kind of reiterate, so losing the only private key could lead to a complete loss of that CBDC possibly. And so, especially if the CBDC system has less intermediation, kind of where I was talking about, where you would have that second or third or fourth or whatever the case is, private key held by an intermediary that just kind of for verification or whatever it happens to be, right? Because again, you can think of this in terms of like access tiering, where you have multiple parties. And so like say you're doing like a cross-border payments, because that's a major thing for CBDCs, or at least a major argument for them from, we'll say, kind of the people who publish these papers, right? Those sort of entities like the BIS, the world central banks, that sort of thing. Excuse me. Right, is the whole cross-border payments argument. So maybe like not only you and then whatever international party you're transacting with, but also like some government entity or embassy or bank or whatever, also has a private key to kind of facilitate that transaction cross borders, whatever the case may be, right? Again, so that private key shows proof of ownership, which basically means there's kind of a vector that can be tracked in a way. If someone else somehow got access to your private key, whether it be, maybe it's even like a central entity. I mean, this is a central bank digital currency, so they might have access to that might not actually be private, right? It's just kind of using the typical terms for crypto in general, it seems. Again, all this kind of all of these videos are kind of just trying to articulate and understand what is in the research I've been doing about CBDCs in general, and also kind of putting the papers themselves that I'm talking about out there, like in the description, like I said earlier, so that you guys can read them and basically create a discussion and get a better understanding in general, right? So anyways, so that part with what I was talking about for proof of ownership really goes into identity privacy, which I've already done videos on. Those are in the US CBDC Design Choice playlist, and that'll be somewhere in here as a card possibly. But anyways, finally, the possible programmability based on demographics and or behavior, right? So kind of the whole, where we're going with like access tiering for CBDCs, right? Since you have this proof of ownership, there's that programmability based on you, your user profile, your behavior, whatever the case may be, possibly even like social credit score if you want to go that route. Whether or not that's too far, I'll leave that up to you to decide. I'm not here to go. That's not the purpose of this video. We'll just keep it there. But that's one con by having this proof of ownership when using a private key, right? Whereas that wasn't a problem with having no signature transactions like we talked about in that video. Right, so with that being said, I'm going to leave this one here, and I will put as cards or end screens in the top right, one for the no signature digital transactions, where I kind of went on to the whole not having that programmability problem, we'll say, and then also the one for multiple signature digital transactions, right? And I hope to see you guys in one of those.